A homeless man saved a boy from bullies in the park. But when he met the child's father, Marcus Johnson had not always been homeless. At 45, his weathered face and graying dreadlocks told a story of hardship, but his eyes still held a spark of dignity and kindness that life on the streets had not managed to extinguish. Once a promising jazz musician, Marcus had fallen on hard times after a series of personal tragedies: the loss of his wife to cancer, a debilitating injury that left him unable to play his beloved saxophone, and a subsequent battle with depression and addiction that cost him his home and livelihood. Now, Marcus called the streets of Chicago his home, finding shelter in alleyways and under bridges. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a gentle demeanor and a strong moral compass. He was known among the homeless community for his willingness to share what little he had, and for his soulful humming that often filled the air around him, a remnant of his musical past. Every day, Marcus would make his way to Millennium Park, where he would sit on a bench, watching the world go by. He found solace in observing the families and tourists enjoying the park, their laughter and joy a bittersweet reminder of the life he once had. It was here that he first noticed young Ethan. Ethan Williams was a 10-year-old boy who frequented the park with his nanny. With his mop of curly brown hair and oversized glasses, Ethan stood out from the other children. He was often alone, his nose buried in a book while other kids played. Marcus recognized in Ethan a familiar loneliness, a sense of not quite fitting in. What Marcus didn't know was that Ethan was the son of Jonathan Williams, one of Chicago's most prominent real estate developers. Jonathan, a 50-year-old widower, was rarely present in his son's life, consumed by his work and the pursuit of success. Ethan's mother had passed away when he was just a toddler, leaving him in the care of a rotating cast of nannies and household staff. As Marcus observed Ethan day after day, he felt a growing sense of protectiveness towards the boy. Little did he know that his life was about to intersect with Ethan's in a way that would change both their lives forever, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge their perceptions of family, redemption, and what it truly means to have a home. It was an unseasonably warm autumn afternoon when the incident occurred. Marcus was in his usual spot on the bench, his threadbare jacket folded neatly beside him. He watched as Ethan arrived at the park, clutching a thick book to his chest. The boy's nanny, absorbed in a phone conversation, barely glanced at Ethan as he made his way to a quiet corner of the playground. Marcus noticed a group of older boys eyeing Ethan with a predatory gleam. He had seen this scenario play out before and tensed, hoping he was misreading the situation. But as Ethan settled onto a bench and opened his book, the group of boys, led by a lanky teenager with a backwards cap, began to approach. "Hey, Four Eyes," the leader called out, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "What you reading? How to be a Loser 101? Ethan's shoulders hunched as he tried to make himself smaller, his eyes fixed firmly on the pages of his book. But the bullies were not deterred by his silence. "I'm talking to you, nerd," the leader said, snatching the book from Ethan's hands. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people?" Ethan reached for his book, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Please give it back. I'm not bothering anyone." The other boys laughed, circling Ethan like sharks. One of them shoved Ethan, causing him to stumble off the bench. "Look at him. He can't even stand up straight." Marcus felt his heart racing. He had promised himself long ago that he would never turn a blind eye to injustice, no matter his circumstances. Without a second thought, he rose from his bench and strode towards the group. "Head," Marcus called out, his deep voice carrying across the playground. "Leave the kid alone." The bullies turned, momentarily startled by the interruption. The leader, quickly regaining his bravado, sneered at Marcus. "Mind your own business, old man. This doesn't concern you." Marcus stood his ground, drawing himself up to his full height. Despite his ragged appearance, there was an undeniable dignity in his stance. "I'm making it my business. You boys ought to be ashamed of yourselves, picking on someone smaller than you. Where's your honor?" The leader scoffed, but Marcus could see uncertainty in the eyes of the other boys. He pressed on, his voice calm but firm. "You think it makes you big to hurt others? It doesn't. It just shows how small you really are inside." There was a tense moment of silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the younger boys in the group stepped back. "Come on, Jake," he said to the leader. "This isn't cool. Let's go." Jake looked from Marcus to Ethan, then back to his wavering group. With a frustrated growl, he threw Ethan's book to the ground. "Whatever. You're not worth our time anyway, freak." As the bullies skulked away, Marcus knelt beside Ethan, who was still on the ground, tears streaming down his face. "You okay, little man?" Marcus asked gently, offering Ethan his hand. Ethan nodded, sniffling as he allowed Marcus to help him up. "Thank you," he stammered, pushing his glasses back up his nose. Marcus picked up Ethan's book, dusting it off before handing it back to the boy. "No need to thank me. Those boys had no right to treat you that way. You remember that, okay?" Ethan clutched the book to his chest, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I will. I'm Ethan," he said, offering a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. I'm Marcus," he replied, returning the smile. Just then, Ethan's nanny rushed over, having finally noticed the commotion. "Ethan, are you all right? What happened?" She eyed Marcus suspiciously, instinctively pulling Ethan closer to her. "It's okay, Miss Chen," Ethan said quickly. "This man, Marcus, he helped me. Some boys were being mean and he made them stop." Miss Chen's expression softened slightly, but she remained wary. "Well, thank you, sir. Come on, Ethan. It's time to go home." As Miss Chen led Ethan away, the boy turned back to wave at Marcus. "Bye, Marcus. Thank you again." Marcus waved back, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. He had done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his interaction with Ethan was far from over. Little did he know just how right he was, and how this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change both their lives forever. In the days following the incident at the park, Marcus found himself thinking often about Ethan. He hoped the boy was okay and that the bullies had left him alone. To his surprise, Ethan returned to the park a few days later, this time accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man who Marcus assumed must be his father. Marcus watched from his usual bench as Ethan excitedly pointed in his direction, clearly recounting the events to his father. The man's brow furrowed as he listened, his eyes scanning the park until they landed on Marcus. With a gentle nudge, he encouraged Ethan to lead the way over to where Marcus sat. As they approached, Marcus stood, suddenly self-conscious of his ragged appearance in the face of the man's crisp suit and polished shoes. Ethan, however, showed no such hesitation, bounding up to Marcus with a wide smile. "Marcus, I told my dad about what you did. This is my father, Mr. Williams," Ethan said, practically bouncing with excitement. Mr. Williams extended his hand, his expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Jonathan Williams, I wanted to thank you personally for helping my son. Ethan hasn't stopped talking about you since it happened." Marcus shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the expensive watch adorning Jonathan's wrist. "It was nothing, sir. I just did what anyone should do." As they talked, Marcus began to realize why Jonathan Williams looked so familiar. He had seen the man's face on billboards and in newspaper articles. Jonathan Williams was one of the most influential real estate developers in Chicago, known for his ambitious projects that were reshaping the city's skyline. The revelation hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. This was the man behind the very development project that had led to the closure of the homeless shelter Marcus had relied on last winter. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. He had saved the son of the man whose actions had, indirectly, made his life even more difficult. Jonathan, unaware of Marcus's internal struggle, continued to express his gratitude. "I'd like to repay you for your kindness. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you." Marcus was about to politely decline when Ethan chimed in, his eyes wide with innocence. "Dad, Marcus doesn't have a home. Can't we help him?" An awkward silence fell over the group. Jonathan looked at Marcus with new eyes, taking in his worn clothes and weathered appearance. To his credit, he didn't recoil or make excuses. Instead, he asked softly, "Is this true, Mr. Johnson?" "Marcus Johnson," Marcus supplied, swallowing his pride. "And yes, it's true. But I don't need charity, Mr. Williams. I'm just glad I could help Ethan." Jonathan seemed to be wrestling with something internally. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but kind. "Mr. Johnson, I insist on doing something to help. Not out of charity, but out of gratitude for what you've done for my son. Please, Come to my office tomorrow. I'm sure we can find a way for me to repay your kindness." As Jonathan scribbled down an address and handed it to Marcus, Ethan beamed up at both men. Marcus looked at the piece of paper in his hand, then back at Jonathan and Ethan. He knew that accepting help went against everything his pride had been telling him for years. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face, he also knew he couldn't refuse. "All right," Marcus said finally. "I'll be there." As Jonathan and Ethan said their goodbyes and walked away, Marcus sat back down on his bench, his mind reeling. He had entered the park that day as he always did, invisible, a mere observer of life. Now, he found himself thrust into a story he never expected, one that held the potential to change everything. The piece of paper in his hand felt like a lifeline, or perhaps a ticking time bomb. Only time would tell which it would turn out to be. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the gleaming skyscraper that housed Jonathan Williams' office, the crumpled piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand. He had spent a restless night debating whether to come, his pride warring with the tiny spark of hope that had ignited in his chest. As he gazed up at the towering building, Marcus felt woefully out of place. He had done his best to clean up, washing in a public restroom and borrowing a slightly less worn shirt from a friend at the shelter. But he knew he still stood out like a sore thumb among the well-dressed professionals bustling in and out of the building. For a moment, Marcus considered turning back. It would be easier to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets, to not confront the complex emotions stirred up by this unexpected turn of events. But then he thought of Ethan's hopeful face, and of the opportunity that lay before him. An opportunity that didn't come often to men in his position. Taking a deep breath, Marcus squared his shoulders and entered the building. The security guard at the desk eyed him suspiciously, but when Marcus explained he had an appointment with Mr. Williams, the guard's demeanor changed. A quick phone call confirmed his story, and soon Marcus found himself ascending in a sleek elevator, his heart pounding with each floor he passed. Jonathan Williams greeted Marcus warmly, ushering him into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." As Marcus sat down, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. This man's wealth and power were palpable, a stark contrast to Marcus's own circumstances. Yet, Jonathan's genuine gratitude and Ethan's innocent desire to help kept Marcus from giving in to bitterness. "Mr. Williams," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I appreciate your offer to help, but I want you to understand that I'm not looking for a handout. I have my pride, and I've managed on my own for a long time." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, Mr. Johnson, and I respect that. But I also believe that sometimes we all need a hand up. What you did for Ethan, it meant more than you know. My son has struggled to fit in, to find his place. Your kindness and bravery showed him that there are still good people in this world, people who will stand up for what's right." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat at Jonathan's words. He thought of his own lost family, of the life he once had. "Your son is a good kid," he said softly. "He deserves to feel safe and valued." "He does," Jonathan agreed. "And that's why I want to help you, Mr. Johnson, not out of pity, but because I believe in repaying kindness with kindness. I have a proposition for you." Jonathan went on to explain that his company was in the process of renovating an old apartment building to provide affordable housing. They were looking for an on-site caretaker, someone who could handle basic maintenance and serve as a point of contact for residents. "The job comes with a small apartment in the building," Jonathan said. "It's not much, but it's a start, a chance to get back on your feet. What do you say?" Marcus sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. The offer was more than he could have hoped for. A job, a roof over his head, a chance at a new beginning. But it also terrified him. It had been so long since he'd had responsibilities, since he'd allowed himself to hope for a better future. I don't know what to say, Mr. Williams," Marcus finally managed. "It's a generous offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. I've been out of the workforce for a long time." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Mr. Johnson, you showed more character and courage in one afternoon than many people do in a lifetime. That's the kind of person I want working for me. The rest, we can teach you." Marcus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought of the years he'd spent on the streets, of the dreams he'd long since abandoned. He thought of Ethan, and of the chance to make a difference in the lives of others who were struggling. And he thought of his younger self, the man he used to be, who would have jumped at this opportunity. Opening his eyes, Marcus met Jonathan's gaze. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." The relief and joy on Jonathan's face were evident as he stood to shake Marcus's hand. "You won't regret this, Mr. Johnson. We'll get started right away." As Marcus left the office that day, his head spinning with the details of his new job and the keys to his new apartment heavy in his pocket, he felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. He knew that this decision would change everything: his daily routines, his sense of self, his entire life. The consequences of this choice were yet to unfold, but as Marcus stepped out onto the busy Chicago street, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there, pushing him forward into an uncertain but potentially brighter future. As Marcus settled into his new role as caretaker of the apartment building, a secondary plot began to unfold, centering around Ethan and his relationship with his father, Jonathan. The boy had been deeply affected by his encounter with Marcus and the subsequent events, and it sparked a change in him that would have far-reaching consequences. Ethan, emboldened by Marcus's act of kindness, began to show a newfound interest in social issues. He started asking his father probing questions about homelessness, poverty, and inequality in their city. Jonathan, caught off guard by his son's sudden engagement with these complex topics, found himself struggling to provide satisfactory answers. One evening, during a rare dinner together, Ethan broached the subject again. "Dad, why are there so many homeless people in Chicago? Can't we do something to help them, like we helped Marcus?" Jonathan paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He had always tried to shield Ethan from the harsher realities of the world, but now he realized that his son was growing up and becoming aware of the world around him. "It's complicated, Ethan," he began. "There are many reasons why people become homeless, and it's not always easy to fix." But Ethan wasn't satisfied with this answer. "But you're always saying that with hard work, anyone can succeed. So why can't homeless people just work hard and get homes?" Jonathan felt a pang of guilt at hearing his own words reflected back at him. He had always prided himself on his work ethic and self-made success, but Ethan's innocent question made him realize the oversimplification in his worldview. Inspired by his son's curiosity and compassion, Jonathan decided to take action. He began to look more closely at the impact of his development projects on low-income communities. He started attending city council meetings about affordable housing and homelessness, often bringing Ethan along. Meanwhile, Ethan threw himself into research, reading everything he could find about homelessness and social inequality. He started a club at his school to raise awareness about these issues, surprising his teachers and classmates with his passion and dedication. As Ethan's involvement grew, so did the time he spent with his father. Jonathan, seeing his son's enthusiasm, began to prioritize these activities over late nights at the office. They volunteered together at local shelters, and Jonathan even invited Ethan to sit in on some of his company's meetings about the affordable housing project. This shared interest began to bridge the gap that had grown between father and son over the years. Jonathan found himself seeing Ethan in a new light, appreciating his son's intelligence and empathy. Ethan, in turn, began to understand the complexities of his father's work and the challenges of creating real change. One day, as they were leaving a volunteer shift at a soup kitchen, Ethan turned to his father. "Dad, I'm proud of what we're doing, but it doesn't feel like enough. Isn't there more we can do?" Jonathan looked at his son, seeing the determination in his eyes. It reminded him of himself at a younger age, before the pursuit of success had narrowed his focus. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "You're right, Ethan," he said. "There is more we can do. And I think it's time we figured out exactly what that is." As they walked to their car, Jonathan's mind was already racing with ideas. He didn't know exactly where this new path would lead them, but he knew that together, he and Ethan could make a real difference. And it had all started with a chance encounter in a park. a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places. In the months that followed, the relationships between Marcus, Ethan, and Jonathan began to evolve in unexpected ways. Marcus, settling into his new role as caretaker, found himself becoming a mentor figure to Ethan, who visited the apartment building regularly under the guise of checking on the project with his father. During these visits, Ethan would often seek out Marcus, peppering him with questions about his life experiences and his thoughts on the social issues Ethan was becoming increasingly passionate about. Marcus, touched by the boy's genuine interest and compassion, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't for years. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench outside the building, Ethan asked, "Marcus, what was the hardest part about being homeless?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "You know, Ethan, it wasn't the cold or the hunger, though those were tough. The hardest part was feeling invisible. People would walk by and look right through you, like you didn't exist. It makes you start to believe that maybe you don't." Ethan nodded solemnly, his young face creased with empathy. "But you never stopped existing, Marcus. You were always important, even when people didn't see it." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat at the boy's words. "You're a wise soul, Ethan," he said softly. "Don't ever lose that compassion of yours. It's a rare and precious thing." As Ethan and Marcus grew closer, Jonathan found himself drawn into their orbit. He began to see Marcus not just as an employee or a charity case, but as a man with a wealth of experience and insight. Their conversations, once awkward and formal, became more relaxed and genuine. One evening, after a long day of meetings about the housing project, Jonathan found himself sitting with Marcus on the rooftop of the apartment building, looking out over the city. "You know, Marcus," Jonathan said, breaking a comfortable silence, "I've been in this business for decades, but I feel like I'm only now starting to understand the real impact of what we do, and I have you and Ethan to thank for that." Marcus looked at him, surprised. "How do you mean?" Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've always thought of myself as a builder, someone who was improving the city, but I never really stopped to think about the people who might be displaced by my projects, or those who could never afford to live in the buildings I was so proud of constructing." Marcus nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "It's easy to miss what you're not looking for," he said gently. "Exactly," Jonathan agreed. "But watching Ethan, seeing his passion for helping others, and getting to know you, hearing your stories, it's changed my perspective. I want to do better, to build not just structures, but communities." As they continued to talk, sharing their experiences and viewpoints, both men felt a shift in their relationship. The barriers of class and circumstance that had initially separated them began to dissolve, replaced by a growing mutual respect and understanding. Meanwhile, Ethan's relationship with his father was undergoing its own transformation. Jonathan, inspired by his son's enthusiasm and Marcus's influence, began to make a conscious effort to be more present in Ethan's life. They started a tradition of weekly brainstorming dinners, where they would discuss ideas for community projects and ways to make a positive impact. During one of these dinners, Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, I've been thinking, what if we started a program to hire people who've experienced homelessness to work on your construction projects? They could learn skills and earn money, and it might help them get back on their feet." Jonathan sat back, impressed by his son's idea. "That's actually a brilliant concept, Ethan. We'd need to work out the details, but it could make a real difference." As they began to flesh out the idea, Jonathan felt a surge of pride and love for his son. He realized that in his pursuit of success, he had nearly missed out on the joy of watching Ethan grow into a thoughtful, compassionate young man. These evolving relationships between Marcus and Ethan, Marcus and Jonathan, and Ethan and his father, were slowly but surely changing each of them. They were learning from each other, challenging each other's perspectives, and forming bonds that went beyond their initial roles. Little did they know that these strengthened connections would soon be put to the test, as challenges arose that would shake the foundation of everything they were building together. The climactic event unfolded on a crisp autumn evening, 6 months after Marcus had taken on his role as caretaker. The affordable housing project was nearing completion, and Jonathan had organized a community open house to showcase the apartments and gather feedback from potential residents. The event was in full swing, with local residents, city officials, and members of the press milling about the newly renovated building. Marcus, dressed in a clean button-down shirt that still felt strange on his shoulders, was giving tours of the apartments. Ethan was enthusiastically explaining the building's green initiatives to anyone who would listen, while Jonathan moved through the crowd, shaking hands and answering questions. As the evening wore on, a commotion near the entrance caught Marcus's attention. A group of protesters had gathered outside, their angry voices carrying into the building. Marcus made his way to the front, where he found Jonathan and Ethan already assessing the situation. The protesters, led by a fiery community activist named Regina Torres, were accusing Jonathan's company of gentrification and displacing longtime residents. "Williams Development doesn't care about our community," Regina shouted through a megaphone. "They're just here to make a profit and push us out." Jonathan tried to approach the group to address their concerns, but the crowd's hostility was palpable. Ethan, his face pale with worry, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, what's going on? Why are they so angry?" Before Jonathan could respond, one of the protesters recognized Marcus. "Look," the man shouted, pointing. "They've even got one of us working for them now. Selling out your own people, huh?" Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions, shame at being singled out, anger at the accusation, and a deep-seated fear of losing everything he had gained. But as he looked at Ethan's frightened face and Jonathan's growing frustration, he knew he had to act. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between the protesters and Jonathan's family. "Please," he said, his voice carrying over the shouts, "I know you're angry, but let's talk about this. I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel powerless and ignored." The crowd quieted slightly, some recognizing Marcus from his days on the streets. Regina eyed him suspiciously, but lowered her megaphone. "So talk," she said. "Tell us why we shouldn't fight this." Marcus looked back at Jonathan and Ethan, then turned to face the crowd fully. "This project isn't perfect," he admitted, "but it's a step in the right direction. I've seen firsthand how Mr. Williams and his son have been working to understand our community's needs. They're trying to create affordable housing, not luxury condos." He went on to explain the job training program they were developing, inspired by Ethan's idea, and the community spaces included in the building's design. As he spoke, Marcus could see the anger in some faces being replaced by curiosity and cautious hope. Regina, however, remained skeptical. "Pretty words," she said, "but how do we know this isn't just for show? How do we know they'll follow through?" It was Ethan who stepped forward then, his young voice clear and determined. "Because we'll be accountable to you," he said. "We want to form a community advisory board with real power to influence decisions. We want to work with you, not against you." A hush fell over the crowd as they absorbed Ethan's words. Marcus felt a surge of pride for the boy, seeing in him the bridge between two worlds that so often failed to understand each other. As the tension began to dissipate, Marcus knew that this moment was a turning point. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time, he felt like true change might be possible. The path forward would not be easy. But standing there, with Ethan's courage and Jonathan's newfound commitment to community, Marcus allowed himself to hope for a future brighter than any he had dared to imagine. In the days following the confrontation at the open house, Marcus, Jonathan, and Ethan found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The incident had made local news, bringing both positive and negative attention to the housing project and forcing them to confront the complex issues surrounding urban development and community rights head-on. Jonathan, taking Ethan's impromptu suggestion to heart, reached out to Regina Torres and other community leaders to begin forming the advisory board. It was a tense process, with years of mistrust and resentment bubbling to the surface in every meeting. Marcus often found himself playing the role of mediator, his unique perspective allowing him to bridge the gap between the developers and the community members. During one particularly heated meeting, Regina slammed her hand on the table, her frustration evident. "How can we trust that this board will have any real power? What's to stop you from nodding along and then doing whatever you want anyway? Jonathan, to his credit, remained calm. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Torres. That's why I'm proposing that we draft a legally binding agreement that outlines the board's authority and the company's commitments to the community. This suggestion marked a turning point in the negotiations. With the help of pro bono lawyers from a local nonprofit, they began the painstaking process of creating a community benefits agreement that would hold Williams Development accountable to the neighborhood's needs and wishes. Throughout this process, Ethan continued to surprise everyone with his insights and dedication. He attended every meeting, often staying up late into the night, researching similar agreements in other cities and coming up with creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. One evening, as Ethan was explaining his latest idea to Marcus, Jonathan overheard them and paused in the doorway, a look of wonder on his face. When did you become so passionate about urban planning, Ethan? He asked, a mix of pride and bewilderment in his voice. Ethan shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I guess I just realized that this is a way I can really help people, like Marcus helped me. Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest at Ethan's words. He looked at Jonathan and saw his own emotion mirrored in the other man's eyes. In that moment, they shared a silent understanding of the profound impact their unlikely friendship had had on all their lives. As weeks turned into months, the conflict resolution process inched forward. There were setbacks and heated arguments, moments when it seemed like the whole endeavor might fall apart. But there were also breakthroughs and moments of connection that kept everyone committed to seeing it through. Marcus found himself growing into his role as a community liaison. His experiences on the streets gave him a unique credibility with the residents, while his newfound understanding of development processes allowed him to explain the company's perspective. He organized tours of the building for skeptical neighbors, set up job fairs for the training program, and spent countless hours listening to concerns and brainstorming solutions. Jonathan, too, was transformed by the process. He began to see his work through new eyes, understanding that true success wasn't just about the bottom line, but about the lives his projects touched. He became a vocal advocate for responsible development within his industry, sometimes facing pushback from colleagues who didn't share his evolving vision. Ethan, for his part, blossomed in this environment of purpose and collaboration. His teachers noted a marked improvement in his grades and class participation, and he began to make friends with kids who shared his budding interest in social justice. Finally, after months of negotiation, revision, and compromise, a comprehensive community benefits agreement was ready to be signed. The document included provisions for affordable housing quotas, local hiring requirements, green spaces, and ongoing community input in future developments. On the day of the signing ceremony, Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching as Jonathan and Regina shook hands over the signed agreement. He felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Ethan beaming up at him. "We did it, Marcus," Ethan said, his eyes shining. "We really did it." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We sure did, kid, but this is just the beginning, you know. The real work starts now." Ethan's smile didn't falter. "I know, but we'll do it together, right?" As Marcus looked around the room, at Jonathan, who caught his eye and gave him a nod of deep respect, at Regina, whose fierce protectiveness of her community had pushed them all to do better, at the mix of residents, officials, and developers all mingling together, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. "Yeah, Ethan," he said, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We'll do it together." The conflict was far from fully resolved. There would be challenges ahead as they worked to implement the agreement and continue building trust. But in that moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. From a chance encounter in a park to a transformative community initiative, they had begun to forge a path toward real, lasting change. As the room erupted in applause, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, sending up a silent prayer of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. When he opened them again, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing he was no longer alone in the fight. The signing of the Community Benefits Agreement marked a significant turning point, not just for the housing project, but for Marcus, Jonathan, and Ethan as well. In the weeks that followed, they found themselves navigating a new landscape, one filled with both exciting opportunities and unexpected challenges. For Marcus, the successful resolution of the conflict brought a renewed sense of purpose. He was offered a permanent position within Williams Development as a community outreach coordinator, a role that would allow him to continue bridging the gap between the company and the neighborhoods they worked in. The job offered stability and the chance to make a real difference, but it also meant stepping fully into a world that was still, in many ways, foreign to him. Jonathan, inspired by the positive outcomes of their community engagement, began to reshape the entire ethos of his company. He announced a new initiative to focus on socially responsible development, prioritizing projects that would benefit underserved communities. This decision was met with mixed reactions from his board and shareholders, some of whom worried about the potential impact on profits. Ethan, emboldened by his role in the negotiations, decided to channel his newfound passion into more concrete action. With the support of his father and Marcus, he started a youth advisory council, bringing together kids from diverse backgrounds to have a say in community development projects. The initiative quickly gained attention, with other companies and city officials taking note of the innovative approach to youth engagement. As they embarked on this new direction, all three found themselves at a crossroads. Marcus had to navigate the transition from outsider to insider, balancing his new role with his connections to the community he came from. Jonathan faced the challenge of convincing his business partners that ethical development could also be profitable. And Ethan, while excited about his new project, had to learn to balance his activism with his schoolwork and personal life. One evening, as they sat together in Jonathan's office discussing their next steps, Ethan voiced the question that was on all their minds. What if we fail? What if we can't really change things? Marcus and Jonathan exchanged a look, both recognizing the weight of the moment. It was Jonathan who finally spoke, his voice firm but gentle. Then we'll learn from it and try again. The important thing is that we're trying to make a difference. Marcus nodded in agreement. Change doesn't happen overnight, Ethan, but every step we take, no matter how small, moves us in the right direction. As they continued to talk, mapping out their plans and dreams for the future, there was a sense of excitement and possibility in the air. They were venturing into uncharted territory, but they were doing it together, and somehow that made all the difference. As the seasons changed and their new initiatives took root, Marcus, Jonathan, and Ethan each found themselves reflecting on their personal growth and the unexpected journey that had brought them together. Marcus, now settled into his role at Williams Development, often marveled at the turns his life had taken. On a crisp autumn morning, as he walked to work in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, he caught his reflection in a storefront window. The man looking back at him was a far cry from the homeless individual who had once roamed these same streets. He thought about the skills he had developed, not just in community outreach and project management, but in navigating complex social situations and advocating for those whose voices often went unheard. There were still moments when he felt out of place in the corporate world, but he had learned to use his unique perspective as an asset rather than a liability. Most profoundly, Marcus realized that he had rediscovered his sense of self-worth. The years on the streets had eroded his belief in his own value, but through his relationships with Ethan and Jonathan and his work in the community, he had rebuilt that foundation. He was no longer invisible. He was a vital part of something larger than himself. Jonathan's growth was equally significant, though in different ways. As he guided his company through its shift towards socially responsible development, he found himself re-evaluating many of his long-held beliefs about success and purpose. The metrics he had once used to measure his worth, profit margins and property values, now seemed hollow compared to the tangible impact he was having on people's lives. He also reflected on his relationship with Ethan, marveling at how their shared mission had brought them closer together. The long hours he had once spent at the office were now often devoted to brainstorming sessions with his son, planning community events, or simply talking about their hopes for the future. Jonathan realized that in trying to build a better community, he had also rebuilt his family. For Ethan, the past months had been a period of tremendous personal growth. The shy, bookish boy who had once felt out of place among his peers was blossoming into a confident young leader. His youth advisory council was thriving, giving him a sense of purpose and belonging he had never experienced before. But beyond the external achievements, Ethan recognized a change in himself. He had developed empathy and understanding for people whose lives were very different from his own. He had learned to stand up for his beliefs, even in the face of opposition. And perhaps most importantly, he had discovered the power of his own voice to inspire change. One evening, as the three of them shared dinner at Jonathan's home, a regular occurrence now, Ethan broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if Marcus hadn't helped me that day in the park?" he asked. Marcus and Jonathan exchanged a glance, both contemplating the question. "I think about it all the time," Marcus admitted. "That moment changed everything for me." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's amazing how a single act of kindness can set off such a chain reaction. Ethan looked at them both, his eyes bright. "I'm glad it happened the way it did. I feel like we were meant to find each other, you know?" As they continued their meal, the conversation flowing easily between them, each of them felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had embarked on this journey as strangers, brought together by chance and circumstance. Now they were bound by something deeper, a shared vision, a common purpose, and a friendship that had transformed them all. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges they had yet to face. But as they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And in that knowledge, they found strength, hope, and a deep sense of belonging. As the sun set over Chicago, casting a warm glow across the city skyline, Marcus stood on the rooftop of the apartment building where his journey had begun. Beside him, Ethan and Jonathan gazed out at the urban landscape, a comfortable silence settling between them. In the distance, they could see the scaffolding of new construction projects, not just Williams development sites, but others inspired by their innovative approach to community-focused building. The Youth Advisory Council Ethan had started was now being replicated in neighborhoods across the city. And Marcus's story had inspired a wave of initiatives aimed at providing opportunities for those experiencing homelessness. "You know," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence, "I used to look at this city and see all the ways I didn't belong. Now I see all the ways we're connected." Jonathan nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We've all learned that, haven't we? That our lives are intertwined in ways we can't always see." Ethan looked up at them both, his young face serious, "And that we all have the power to make a difference, if we're brave enough to try." As they stood there, three unlikely friends united by a chance encounter and bound by a shared purpose, the theme of their journey resonated clearly. It was a story of transformation, of individuals, of a community, of perspectives. It was a testament to the ripple effect of compassion, the power of seeing the humanity in others, and the profound change that can occur when people from different walks of life come together with a common goal. Their story was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more bridges to build. But in that moment, as they looked out over the city they were helping to reshape, they were filled with a sense of hope and possibility. They had learned that home isn't just a place, but a feeling of belonging. And in finding each other, they had all, in their own ways, come home.